You're lying in bed. The lights are off, the room is quiet, and the day has finally stopped asking things of you. Your body is settling into the mattress, your breathing is starting to slow, and somewhere in that growing stillness, right there, in the space between the last thought you chose to think and the first one that arrives uninvited, something begins to happen. A face you weren't expecting, a feeling you spent the entire day outrunning, a sentence someone said to you 6 days ago that suddenly sounds completely different in the dark than it did under fluorescent lighting. You know this moment. You've lived it thousands of times. And almost every single time, you've done the same thing with it. Reached for your phone, forced your thoughts somewhere else, or just pushed through it the way you push through a cold hallway on the way to a warm room. Something to get past. Something to survive on the way to unconsciousness. Carl Jung would have told you that this moment, the one you keep rushing through, might be the most psychologically significant minutes of your entire day, and that what you do with it, or refuse to do with it, is quietly shaping who you're becoming in ways your waking mind will never see. He spent years studying this threshold, the borderland between waking and sleep, where the constructed self begins to loosen its grip, and something deeper starts speaking in a language most people have forgotten how to hear. Jung didn't just observe this space in his patients, he practiced it himself, every night, during the most intense and destabilizing period of his life. And what he found there became the foundation for some of his most radical ideas about how human beings actually change. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this threshold, what's really happening in those minutes before sleep, why what you bring to them matters far more than anyone has told you, and what begins to shift, slowly and then unmistakably, when you stop crossing this border unconsciously and start arriving at it on purpose. Because there's something waiting for you in the dark between today and tomorrow, and you've been stepping over it every single night. Here's what most people actually do with the last few minutes of their day. They scroll. They watch something, anything, to fill the quiet. They replay the argument they had at lunch, rehearsing better responses they'll never deliver. They mentally draft tomorrow's to-do list as if organizing the future could settle the present. They worry. They plan. They do anything, literally anything, to keep the silence from settling all the way in. And none of this is weakness or laziness. It's a pattern so deeply ingrained that most people don't even register it as a choice anymore. It's just what the end of the day looks like. Phone on the nightstand, screen glowing blue against the ceiling, thumb moving on autopilot until the eyelids get heavy enough to win. But here's what's underneath that pattern, and this is the part that matters. Both the scrolling and the ruminating have something fundamental in common. They're both ways of keeping the channel closed. The phone keeps the silence from arriving. The mental rehearsal keeps the real material from surfacing. And the reason people fill this space so aggressively, even when they're exhausted, even when they know the screen is keeping them awake, even when they've promised themselves 100 times they'll stop, is because what lives in that silence is something the daytime self doesn't want to meet. The silence before sleep contains things, specific things, feelings that didn't get felt during the day because there wasn't time or permission, recognitions about relationships that the performing self can't afford to acknowledge at 9 in the morning, questions about direction, about meaning, about whether the life being lived is actually the life that wants to be lived. This material doesn't arrive politely. It doesn't wait for an invitation. It surges the moment the defense is thin, which is exactly what happens when the body starts preparing for sleep and the ego begins its nightly retreat. The irony is devastating when you see it clearly. The thing most people work hardest to avoid in those final minutes is the very thing that, if engaged with honestly, would do more for their psychological development than almost anything they accomplish during 16 hours of waking effort. The most neglected practice in modern life doesn't require a therapist, a retreat, a book, or a program. It requires about 10 minutes of honest stillness in a dark room, and the willingness to let whatever surfaces actually be there. Jung understood this with a specificity that went far beyond theory. During the period between 1913 and 1916, the years after his break with Freud, when his professional world had fractured and his internal world was erupting in ways that genuinely frightened him, Jung developed a nightly practice that he later described as one of the most important things he ever did. He would sit, or lie, in the threshold between waking and sleep, and instead of resisting what arrived, he would attend to it. He would let images come. He would follow feelings without demanding they explain themselves. He would notice what surfaced without immediately categorizing it as rational or irrational, significant or trivial, acceptable or dangerous. He called the state he was working in the hypnagogic state, the neurological and psychological borderland where waking consciousness hasn't fully released its hold, but sleep hasn't claimed you either. It's a strange territory. The rules of daytime thinking start bending. Logic loosens. Images appear that the waking mind wouldn't generate. Emotions arrive at full intensity without any of the day's context to explain them. Memories from years or decades ago surface alongside feelings about something that happened this afternoon, and the connections between them are visible in a way they never would be under the bright light of conscious analysis. Jung didn't treat this as mystical. He treated it as functional. The hypnagogic state, in his framework, was a window, a naturally occurring moment when the barrier between the conscious mind and the unconscious became permeable enough for real communication to happen. The ego, which spent the entire day managing, controlling, filtering, and performing, was finally loosening its grip. And the unconscious, which had been waiting patiently with everything it had been trying to say all day, finally had a crack to speak through. What fascinated Jung was how universal this window was, and how universally it was wasted. Every human being passes through the hypnagogic state every single night. It's built into the architecture of how the brain moves from waking to sleep. It's always there. The threshold is always open, and almost everyone crosses it the way you'd cross a hallway, without looking, without stopping, without any awareness that you just passed through the most psychologically fertile territory you'll encounter in a 24-hour period. Jung kept returning to this threshold throughout his career, long after the acute crisis of 1913 had passed. He wrote about it in his private journals. He discussed it with patients. He developed techniques specifically designed to engage it. And he argued, with increasing conviction as he aged, that this space, these quiet, dark, seemingly empty minutes before sleep, represented one of the most direct lines of communication the unconscious ever offered. A line that was available every single night, free of charge, requiring nothing except the willingness to show up and listen. To understand why this matters as much as Jung believed it did, you need to feel what this threshold is actually like from the inside. Because it's easy to talk about the hypnagogic state in abstract terms, permeability of consciousness, loosening of ego structures, unconscious communication. But the experience of it is far more specific and far more recognizable than the language suggests. Think about the last time you lay in bed, fully awake, having just put down whatever you were holding, the phone, the book, the remote, and the room went still. There's a particular quality to the first 30 seconds of that stillness. The body is winding down, but the mind isn't ready yet. It's still buzzing at daytime frequency, still generating the kind of thought it generates when you're upright and functional. Practical, directed, purposeful thought. What do I need to do tomorrow? Did I lock the door? I should text them back in the morning. Then something shifts. It's subtle, and most people miss it entirely because they're already reaching back for the phone or deliberately steering their thoughts towards something safe. But if you stay with it, if you just lie there and let the shift happen, the quality of your thinking changes. The purposeful thoughts get quieter, and something else moves in underneath them. A feeling that doesn't have a name yet. An image that seems random but carries a strange emotional charge. The face of someone you haven't thought about in months, arriving with a specificity that startles you. Their expression, the way they looked at you during a conversation you thought you'd forgotten. The thing they said that you laughed off at the time, but that lands differently now, in the quiet, in the dark, without the daytime defenses to deflect it. This is the unconscious making its move. And it moves like this because the conditions finally allow it. During the day, you're managing, you're performing, you're navigating social situations, fulfilling obligations, maintaining the version of yourself that the world expects. That management takes energy, and part of what it manages is the suppression of anything that would disrupt the performance. The grief you can't afford to feel at 10 in the morning because you have a meeting. The anger at someone close to you that you've been swallowing because expressing it would create a conflict you don't have the bandwidth for. The quiet, persistent question about whether you're actually happy or just functional. A question that surfaces and gets pushed down so quickly during waking hours that you barely register it as a thought. All of that material, every feeling suppressed, every question dodged, every recognition avoided, accumulates. It doesn't evaporate. It pools somewhere below the surface of conscious awareness, and it waits. And the moment the ego's surveillance system starts powering down for the night, the material begins to rise. Like water finding its level when a dam is partially lowered. It's been pressing against the barrier all day. The barrier thins at the threshold, and through it comes everything the day wouldn't let you feel. Jung understood this process with remarkable precision. He observed in himself and in hundreds of patients that the material surfacing at the hypnagogic threshold was categorically different from the thoughts produced by the waking, functioning mind. Waking thoughts are shaped by purpose. They're oriented toward outcomes. What do I need to accomplish? How did that interaction go? What should I say tomorrow to fix this? These thoughts serve the ego's agenda: management, control, optimization, performance. They're useful for navigating the external world, but they're fundamentally divorced from the deeper psychological reality underneath. The material that surfaces at the threshold is shaped by something else entirely. Jung would have called it truth, though he would have qualified the word heavily. The threshold material reflects what actually happened emotionally during the day, what you actually felt beneath what you performed. The interaction that looked fine on the surface, but left something unsettled in your chest. The moment of recognition you immediately buried because following it would require changing something you're afraid to change. The desire you don't admit to during daylight because it contradicts the identity you've spent years constructing. This material isn't random, even when it feels random. The face that appears from nowhere, the fragment of a childhood memory, the emotion that seems disconnected from anything happening in your current life. All of it is connected to something the unconscious is trying to process. Jung spent years documenting these connections in his own experience, and in the reports of patients who began paying attention to what surfaced at the threshold. The seemingly random memory of a childhood moment would turn out to be connected, through feeling rather than logic, to something unresolved in the person's current life. The emotion without a clear object would turn out to be the suppressed response to an interaction the conscious mind had dismissed as unimportant. The image that made no sense rationally carried, when attended to, a message about something the person had been avoiding for months. This is the unconscious speaking in its own language, and its language is imagistic, emotional, associative. It connects things across years and decades that the linear, logical waking mind would never link. It operates by resonance rather than reason. Two experiences from completely different periods of your life share an emotional frequency, and the unconscious places them side by side at the threshold. And suddenly, a pattern becomes visible that you couldn't have discovered through any amount of conscious analysis. A pattern about how you respond to being needed, about what you actually do when you feel unseen, about the specific flavor of loneliness that runs through your romantic relationships, like a thread you never noticed because you were too busy performing contentment. People who learn to attend to these threshold arrivals, who stop reaching for the phone and start receiving what surfaces, begin to see things about themselves they've never seen before, and the seeing happens gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. It takes time. The first few nights are usually chaotic because there's a backlog. Weeks, months, sometimes years of suppressed material pushing through the newly opened channel. The feelings are intense, sometimes overwhelming. The images are vivid and sometimes disturbing. The thoughts don't make sense, and the urge to shut it all down and go back to scrolling is enormous. But Jung observed something consistent in every person who stayed with it past the initial chaos. The material begins to organize itself. The nightly eruptions settle into something more like a conversation. The unconscious, having been given permission to speak, stops shouting and starts communicating. The feelings become more specific, more traceable, more useful. The images carry clearer emotional information. The fragments start connecting to each other, and the connections reveal patterns that the waking mind missed entirely. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the unconscious as a compensatory system. It compensates for the conscious mind's blind spots. Whatever you're refusing to see during the day, the unconscious is trying to show you at night. Whatever you're suppressing, it's trying to surface. Whatever question you're avoiding, it's trying to pose. And the threshold, those few minutes before sleep, when the ego loosens its grip just enough for the deeper material to rise, is the primary delivery system. The daily opportunity for the psyche to correct course, to integrate what's been split off, to bring what's been hidden into enough light that it can finally be worked with. If you've ever lain awake wondering why you can't stop thinking about something, why a particular interaction keeps replaying, why a particular feeling won't let go, why a particular face keeps appearing, you've been experiencing this system at work. The unconscious doesn't bring you random material. It brings you the material you most need to reckon with. The thought you can't shake is the thought you most need to feel your way through. The face that keeps appearing belongs to the person connected to something unresolved in you. The emotion that arrives without explanation is the emotion the day demanded you suppress, and it's been waiting all day for this exact moment, this exact quiet, this exact absence of performance to finally be felt. And here's where it starts to become clear why Jung believed this threshold could change a life. Because what you do with these minutes, whether you receive this material or suppress it, whether you attend to what surfaces or numb yourself past it, determines what the unconscious has to work with overnight. And the unconscious doesn't stop working when you fall asleep. It keeps going. It processes, integrates, connects, and prepares. But the quality of that overnight work depends entirely on the quality of what you gave it at the threshold. Imagine two versions of the same night. In the first, you scroll until your eyes are heavy, fall asleep mid-video, and give the unconscious nothing to work with except fragmented content and suppressed feeling. In the second, you spend 10 minutes lying in the dark, letting the day's real material surface, feeling what actually needs to be felt, holding a question you don't know the answer to. Same night, same brain, same sleep. Completely different psychological process happening underneath. Because in the second version, you've handed the unconscious something real, something honest, something it can actually use, and it will use it in ways you won't see until morning, or sometimes for days afterward, when something shifts in your perception and you can't quite explain why, but a decision that was paralyzing suddenly has a direction, or a relationship you were confused about suddenly makes a different kind of sense. This is the threshold Jung kept coming back to. The one he practiced in his own life during the years that nearly broke him and ultimately made him into the psychologist he became. The one he guided patients toward, carefully, knowing that what waited there was uncomfortable and sometimes frightening, but also knowing that nothing in his decades of work had proven more consistently transformative than this simple, ancient, universally available practice. Lying still in the dark, letting the day's performance fall away, receiving what surfaces, carrying something honest into sleep. And the thing that changes everything, the insight Jung built an entire methodology around, the one he returned to again and again across 40 years of writing and practice, goes deeper than attention. Because paying attention to what surfaces is the first step, and for many people, it's enough to begin shifting something fundamental. But underneath the attention is a second layer, one that involves the shadow, the parts of yourself you've been most committed to not seeing. And what happens when the threshold forces a meeting you've been avoiding for years? That second layer is where the real transformation lives, and it asks something harder than simply lying still in the dark with your eyes open. Here's something most people never consider. When you fall asleep, your mind doesn't stop working. It shifts. The conscious mind, the one that managed your emails, monitored your tone in conversations, decided what to say and what to hold back, that mind steps off stage. But the deeper mind, the one Jung spent his entire career trying to understand, comes forward. And it gets to work on whatever you left it. This is the part that changes everything about how you think about those final minutes before sleep. Because what you carry across that threshold, the emotional residue, the unprocessed fragments, the things you let yourself feel or refuse to feel, becomes the raw material your unconscious works with for the next 6, 7, 8 hours. You're handing it a job. Every single night, whether you realize it or not, you're handing your unconscious mind a job. Jung observed this with a consistency that made him take it very seriously. The unconscious doesn't clock out when you lose awareness. It continues processing, integrating, sorting through the material of your life with a kind of intelligence that operates nothing like conscious thought. Where the waking mind is linear, step 1, step 2, cause and effect, the unconscious mind works associatively. It connects a feeling from this morning to a memory from 15 years ago. It links the tension you felt in a conversation today with a pattern that's been running since childhood. It draws on everything you've ever experienced, not just what you consciously remember, and it weaves connections your daytime mind is too narrow and too busy to make. But here's what Jung kept emphasizing, and what almost nobody talks about. The quality of that overnight work depends entirely on the quality of what you give it at the threshold. If you gave it suppression, if you spent the last 20 minutes before sleep numbing yourself with content, scrolling through other people's lives, drowning the silence in noise, you gave it almost nothing to work with. The unconscious received the psychological equivalent of a blank page. The opportunity is gone. You'll wake up tomorrow feeling vaguely unrested in a way that has nothing to do with how many hours you slept, and everything to do with what those hours were spent processing, which, in this case, was close to nothing meaningful. If you gave it anxiety, if you spent those last minutes replaying the day's conflicts, rehearsing tomorrow's problems, running worst-case scenarios on a loop, the unconscious received a very specific instruction: process threat, and it will. Your dreams will be characterized by chase, by conflict, by the feeling of being trapped or unprepared. You'll wake with your jaw clenched and your shoulders tight, and a low hum of dread already running before your feet hit the floor. Because the unconscious did exactly what you asked. You told it the world was dangerous, and it spent 8 hours elaborating on that theme. But there's a third option, the one Jung discovered through his own practice and then watched transform patient after patient over decades of work. If you bring the unconscious something real, an honest feeling you actually experienced today, a question you've been avoiding, a piece of your own inner life that you've been too busy or too defended to sit with, the unconscious has genuine material to work with. And what it does with genuine material is extraordinary. It integrates. It connects across timelines. It surfaces insights that the waking mind couldn't reach because the waking mind was too committed to its own story, its own logic, its own need to already know the answer. Jung would have called this the overnight elaboration of the psyche. He believed it was one of the primary mechanisms through which real psychological change happened, not through willpower or effort alone, but through what the unconscious was given permission to work on while the ego was out of the way. And that permission is granted or denied in those few quiet minutes before you disappear into sleep. Nowhere else. The threshold is the handoff point. It's where you either give your deeper mind something worth working with, or you give it nothing, or you give it fear. And then you wonder why you keep waking up feeling the same. Jung developed a specific practice for this threshold. He called it active imagination, though what he did in the minutes before sleep was a quieter, more contained version of the full technique. It wasn't meditation in the way most people understand it. It wasn't visualization. It wasn't affirmation or gratitude journaling or any of the things that get packaged and sold as nighttime routines. It was something simpler and, in many ways, harder. It was showing up, honestly, to whatever was there. During the years after his break with Freud, the period he later described as his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung spent his evenings in this practice almost every night. He would lie in the dark and consciously set down the day's performance. He wouldn't review what happened strategically or analyze his interactions. He would ask himself a different kind of question. What actually moved through me today? What did I feel that I didn't stop to acknowledge? What passed through me that I was too busy, too defended, too committed to my role to let myself experience fully? And then he'd wait. He wouldn't force anything. He wouldn't try to generate insight or manufacture a feeling. He'd attend to the first minutes of stillness and notice what arrived on its own. What arrived was rarely comfortable. Jung wrote about this honestly. The first wave was usually the day's anxieties, the unfinished things, the small failures, the interactions that went sideways. But beneath that first wave, if he stayed with it instead of reaching for distraction, something else would begin to surface. Images. Feelings without obvious sources. Fragments of memory that seemed unrelated to anything happening in his present life. The kind of material that the waking mind dismisses as random noise. Jung refused to dismiss it. He followed it. He wrote it down. He sat with images that made no immediate sense and resisted the urge to analyze them prematurely. Because he understood something fundamental about the language of the unconscious that most people miss entirely. The unconscious doesn't speak in arguments. It speaks in images, in feelings, in symbols that carry meaning the way music carries meaning. Not through logic, but through resonance. And the threshold before sleep is one of the few moments in ordinary daily life where you can briefly meet the unconscious in its own language, on its own terms, without the ego's translation apparatus stripping out everything that doesn't fit its preferred narrative. This is what made Jung's practice so different from rumination, which it superficially resembles. Rumination is the conscious mind grinding on a problem in loops, trying to force a resolution through repetitive thought. It's the ego insisting on control, insisting on figuring it out, insisting that if it just thinks hard enough, the anxiety will resolve. Rumination is exhausting precisely because it never works. The waking mind doesn't have the resources to resolve what's coming from the unconscious because the material lives in a different dimension of the psyche entirely. What Jung did at the threshold was the opposite of rumination. He let go of the need to resolve. He stopped trying to figure it out. He attended to what surfaced and allowed it to be what it was: incomplete, confusing, sometimes disturbing, without demanding that it make sense on the ego's terms. He was, in essence, listening. And the unconscious, when it's actually listened to rather than suppressed or overridden, begins to communicate with increasing clarity over time. Like any relationship, it responds to genuine attention. He spent years in this practice, and what he discovered through it became foundational to everything he later taught about psychological development. The threshold before sleep wasn't a minor detail of daily life. It was, potentially, the single most reliable point of access to the deeper psyche that ordinary existence offered. And most people were passing through it unconscious every night, losing that access, and then spending their waking hours wondering why they felt disconnected from themselves. If you've been sensing that disconnect, if something in the way this script describes that threshold is landing somewhere real in you, touching something you felt but haven't had words for, there's a set of reflection exercises we put together that might meet you exactly where you are. It's called True Self-Discovery. 24 practices drawn from Jung's approach to this kind of inner attention, built for people who are ready to stop crossing these thresholds unconsciously and start listening to what's been waiting in the silence. The link is below. Take a look when you're ready. Because there's a harder piece of this that needs to be said. And it has to do with what, specifically, most people are working so hard to avoid at the threshold. The material that surfaces in the minutes before sleep, the thoughts that send you reaching for the phone, the feelings that make the silence feel unbearable, the memories and images that arrive uninvited and unwanted. That material isn't random. Jung was very clear about this. It's the shadows material, the parts of yourself that your daytime persona has rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge. And they surface at the threshold because the threshold is where the persona's control weakens. The mask comes off when the performance ends, and the things that were living behind it start pushing through. Think about what actually arrives in those moments when the room goes quiet and you're alone with yourself. The face of someone you're in conflict with, someone you've been telling yourself you're fine about, the feeling from an interaction 3 days ago that you smoothed over in the moment, but that's still sitting in your chest. The question about your relationship, your work, your direction that you've been refusing to let yourself ask because you're afraid of what the answer might be. The memory that keeps surfacing despite how many times you've pushed it back down. These aren't malfunctions, these are messages. And every time you suppress them, every time you pick up the phone and scroll until they quiet, every time you force your mind somewhere else, every time you deploy whatever form of numbing you've perfected over years of practice, the messages don't disappear, they move deeper. Jung observed what happens when threshold material is consistently suppressed, and it wasn't subtle. The material finds other exits. The anxiety you wouldn't let yourself feel at the threshold shows up as a tightness in your chest that persists throughout the next day. The unacknowledged feeling about someone close to you leaks out sideways, as irritability, as emotional distance, as a sharpness in your voice that surprises you because you don't know where it came from. The question you refuse to sit with at the threshold doesn't dissolve. It goes underground and starts shaping your behavior from a place you can't see. Over months and years, consistently suppressed threshold material accumulates. Jung watched this accumulation play out in patient after patient. The dreams become more intense, more disturbing, harder to ignore. The body starts carrying what the mind refuses to acknowledge: chronic tension, digestive issues, sleep that never quite restores. Moods arrive from nowhere, persistent and thick, that don't connect to anything happening in the present because their source is buried under years of nightly suppression. The psyche is patient, it will wait. But it won't stop trying to communicate, and the longer you refuse to listen at the threshold, the louder and more disruptive the communication becomes. This isn't a horror story. It's an honest accounting of what avoidance actually costs when it becomes a nightly practice. If you've been consistently numbing yourself at the threshold, and most people have because the culture provides 100 tools for doing exactly that, you haven't been protecting yourself from something dangerous. You've been redirecting a pressure that was trying to help you, and that pressure has been building in places you can't access through conscious effort alone. And here's the question that sits at the center of all of this, the one the narrator in this kind of script usually dances around but that Jung would have asked directly. What, exactly, are you protecting? Because the avoidance makes sense. Of course it does. The silence is uncomfortable. The material that surfaces is often painful. The feelings are raw, and the questions are the kind that don't have easy answers. Nobody wants to lie in the dark and feel the full weight of what they've been carrying. The impulse to reach for the phone, to fill the silence, to numb the threshold, that impulse is completely human and completely understandable. But what is it protecting? Jung was precise about this. The avoidance at the threshold is almost always protecting something the ego has decided is too dangerous to look at directly. An uncomfortable truth about a relationship you've invested years in. A recognition of your own role in a dynamic you've been blaming entirely on someone else. A desire that your conscious mind has declared inadmissible. Something you want that contradicts the identity you've built. A grief you haven't let yourself feel because feeling it would mean admitting that something is actually over. The protection makes sense. The cost of it, accumulated across thousands of nights, is enormous. Because every night you suppress that material is a night the unconscious doesn't get to work on it. Every night you numb the threshold is a night the psyche's overnight processing function runs on empty. Every night you avoid what's actually there is a night you wake up the next morning exactly as stuck, exactly as defended, exactly as disconnected from yourself as you were the day before. And then you do it again, and again, and the years pass, and the distance between you and your own inner life widens so gradually that you don't even notice it's happened until one day the disconnection itself becomes the thing you can't ignore. What if the thoughts you've been reaching for the phone to avoid are the most important thoughts you have all day? Sit with that for a second, because Jung would have sat with it. He would have let it land without rushing to soften it. Now let me tell you what he observed in the people who stopped avoiding, because this is where the script turns, and it turns quietly. The changes weren't dramatic. That's the first thing worth saying, because the culture conditions us to expect transformation to look like an explosion. Sudden, visible, undeniable. What Jung saw in people who began attending to the threshold instead of suppressing it looked more like a slow tide coming in. You almost couldn't see it moving, but over weeks and months, the waterline was unmistakably higher. The first thing that shifted was the quality of the material itself. When threshold eruptions are consistently suppressed, they arrive frantic, compressed, overwhelming, like messages that have been trapped and are desperate to get through. When they begin to be received, they change character. The urgency diminishes. The content becomes less chaotic and more coherent. The feelings that surface still carry weight, but they stop feeling like attacks and start feeling more like communications. Because they are communications. They always were. They just stopped screaming once someone started listening. Over time, patterns that had been completely invisible during waking hours became visible at the threshold. The same feeling would surface 3 nights in a row, a specific kind of tension that accompanied thoughts about a particular person or a particular area of life. During the day, that tension was too diffuse to notice, too woven into the fabric of routine to isolate. At the threshold, stripped of context and distraction, it stood alone, recognizable, named, finally, for what it was. Jung watched patients begin to use the threshold the way a navigator uses stars, as orientation points. The recurring feelings weren't problems to solve. They were indicators of where the psyche's attention was actually focused, underneath all the day's noise. A patient who noticed the same uneasiness surfacing every night around their marriage wasn't discovering something new. They were finally letting themselves see something that had been there for years, something the persona had successfully kept below the waterline during every waking hour. And here's what happened once those patterns became visible. The people who saw them started making different decisions. Not because someone told them to, not because they'd read a framework or followed a program, because the unconscious, given real material to work with overnight, had begun integrating it. Connections that the waking mind couldn't make, because the waking mind was too committed to its existing story, started forming in the dark. And the person would wake up and find that something had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. A situation that felt impossibly tangled the night before now had a thread they could pull. A decision that had paralyzed them for months suddenly had a direction that felt right in their body, even before they could articulate why. Jung called this the work of individuation happening in ordinary time, not in a retreat, not in a crisis, not in therapy, though therapy could support it, in the accumulated effect of nightly, honest attention to what the unconscious was trying to say. It was the quietest form of transformation he ever witnessed, and over decades of practice, he came to believe it was among the most powerful. There's one more layer to this that needs to be said before we move forward, because it's the piece that takes the threshold from something passive, lying there and receiving whatever comes, to something that Jung considered genuinely active. And it involves something you carry into the dark deliberately. Jung identified a practice that went beyond simply attending to what surfaces. He noticed that the people who changed most profoundly at the threshold were the ones who brought something with them. A question, a real one, not an affirmation, not an intention packaged in optimistic language, not a gratitude list, though he had nothing against gratitude. A genuine question, the kind that doesn't know its own answer, the kind the day raised but couldn't resolve, the kind that points towards something that matters without pretending to already understand it. What am I actually afraid of here? What do I already know about this situation that I haven't let myself admit? What is this feeling that keeps returning, and what is it trying to show me? Questions like these are fundamentally different from rumination, even though they live in similar territory. Rumination demands an answer. It loops. It grinds on the same problem with the same inadequate tools, trying to force resolution through sheer repetitive effort. A real threshold question is open. It doesn't demand resolution. It invites participation from something larger than the waking mind. It says to the unconscious, I don't know the answer to this. I'm willing to not know. Work on it with me. Jung carried these questions into sleep the way you might carry a lantern into a room you've never entered. Not to illuminate everything at once, just to see what's closest, just to make out the first shapes. And what he found what he documented across years of his own practice and then observed in patient after patient, was that the unconscious responds to genuine questions. The answers don't arrive the way the conscious mind expects them to, packaged, logical, complete. They arrive as shifts in feeling, as new associations on waking that weren't available the night before, as a sudden clarity in the middle of an unrelated conversation the next day where something clicks into place that had been loose for months, as dreams that speak to the question in images rather than arguments, dreams that don't explain themselves, but leave behind a residue of understanding that the waking mind can feel even when it can't fully articulate. The unconscious, when given a genuine question at the threshold, works on it with resources the conscious mind simply doesn't have. It draws on the full depth of your experience, not just what you remember, but what your body holds, what your earliest years inscribed in you, what decades of living have deposited in layers too deep for conscious recall. It makes connections across timelines the waking mind can't span, and it does this work in the dark, while you sleep, without requiring anything from you except the honesty of the question and the willingness to carry it across the threshold without already knowing the answer. This is what Jung meant when he said the unconscious was not the enemy of consciousness, but its necessary partner. The waking mind does its work during the day, analyzing, deciding, performing, managing. The unconscious does its work at night, integrating, connecting, processing what the day produced. Both are essential. Both are incomplete without the other, and the threshold between them, that brief, fragile, chronically neglected doorway, is where the partnership is either honored or abandoned. Most people abandon it every night without knowing they're doing it. Jung spent his life trying to show them what that abandonment was costing them, and what became possible when they stopped. So, what does this actually look like when someone stops crossing the threshold unconsciously and starts arriving at it? The answer is quieter than you'd expect. There's no dramatic ritual, no radical overhaul of your evening routine, no spiritual ceremony performed in candlelight. What Jung practiced, and what he observed in the patients who changed most fundamentally over time, was something so understated that most people would dismiss it as nothing. And maybe that's why it works. The ego doesn't recognize it as a threat. It slips beneath the radar of the part of you that resists every attempt at genuine change, because it doesn't look like an attempt at anything. It looks like lying in bed in the dark, doing very little. But the quality of attention inside that very little is what makes it everything. The first thing that shifts is the moment of arrival. There's a point each night when the day is genuinely over. The phone goes down, the book closes, the screen goes dark, and you're left with yourself. Most people slide past this moment without registering it. They're still mentally composing emails, still replaying something someone said at lunch, still running the day's machinery on fumes. The body is in bed, but the person hasn't shown up yet. They're still out there somewhere, scattered across a dozen unfinished tasks and half-processed interactions. What Jung described was something different, a brief, deliberate landing, the conscious recognition that the day's performance has ended and that whatever happened today, whatever moved through you, whatever you felt and didn't say, whatever you avoided and whatever you absorbed, is now here in the room with you. You don't have to do anything with it yet. You just have to acknowledge that it exists. The internal equivalent of walking through a door and closing it behind you. You're here now. In the dark, in the quiet. And the question that begins the practice is deceptively simple. What actually happened today? That question sounds obvious, but it's almost never asked honestly. When most people review their day, they review the schedule. What they did, where they went, what got accomplished, what didn't. The emotional day, the one happening underneath all that activity, goes unexamined. The way a particular conversation left a residue they can still feel in their chest. The moment when something a colleague said triggered a response completely disproportionate to what was actually happening. The slow, accumulating weight of performing competence or warmth or stability when what they actually felt was uncertainty or frustration or a sadness they couldn't name. That emotional day is still in the room. It's been in the room the whole time. The question just turns toward it. Jung wasn't interested in analysis at this point. He didn't recommend lying there dissecting why you felt what you felt, or constructing explanations for your emotional reactions. That's the waking mind doing what it always does, trying to manage experience by explaining it. What he practiced was closer to witnessing, letting the day's emotional reality exist without immediately making it mean something. The conversation that left a residue, let the residue be there. The disproportionate reaction, let it sit without judgment. The sadness you couldn't name, let it stay unnamed for now. This is where most people hit the first wall of resistance, because the waking mind hates unresolved material. It wants to categorize, fix, explain, or dismiss. And when it can't do any of those things, it reaches for the phone. It reaches for distraction. It generates busy thoughts to fill the silence, because the silence, left unfilled, starts showing you things you've organized your entire waking life around not seeing. Jung understood this resistance intimately. He felt it himself during his years of threshold work. The pull toward distraction at exactly the moment when something important is trying to surface. That pull is the ego recognizing that its authority is being questioned and responding with the only tool it has, noise. The practice is to stay anyway, to let the noise pass through and settle, to notice that underneath the first wave of the day's anxieties and unfinished business, there's usually something else, something quieter, something that's been trying to reach you for a while, maybe days, maybe longer, a feeling about the direction your life is moving, a recognition about a relationship you've been avoiding looking at honestly, a question that keeps forming and dissolving before it can fully articulate itself, because every time it starts to come together, you distract yourself before it finishes the sentence. The second part of the practice, as Jung described it through his own journals and through his work with patients, involves the question you carry into sleep. And this distinction matters more than almost anything else in the entire framework. The question isn't an affirmation. It's not a gratitude list. It's not a visualization of your ideal tomorrow. Those practices have their own value, but they operate on a completely different level. They're the conscious mind directing the experience. The threshold question is the conscious mind stepping back and asking the unconscious to participate. What do I already know about this that I haven't admitted yet? What is this recurring feeling actually pointing toward? What am I protecting by avoiding this? These aren't questions designed to produce answers in the next 30 seconds. They're invitations. They open a door and leave it open. And then sleep comes, and the conscious mind, with its desperate need to control and resolve, finally steps out of the way. What happens next is something Jung trusted more than almost any other psychological process he ever observed. The unconscious picks up what the conscious mind laid down. It works on the question the way a river works on stone, slowly, in the dark, through pathways the surface mind can't follow. And the material it uses to work on it spans everything you've ever experienced, not just what happened today. Memories, associations, symbolic connections, emotional patterns that link your present to experiences you haven't consciously thought about in years. The unconscious doesn't operate within the day's narrow frame. It operates across the full span of a life. And when you give it an honest question at the threshold, you're giving it permission to bring the full span of your life to bear on something the conscious mind has been trying to solve with only today's limited resources. Jung noticed that answers, when they came, rarely arrived as fully formed insights. They came as shifts. Someone would wake up, and the thing that had been paralyzing them for weeks would feel slightly different, still present, still real, but somehow less tangled. Or they'd notice during a morning conversation that they responded differently than they would have the day before, and they couldn't trace the change to any specific decision. Something had moved in the night. Something had reorganized. The question hadn't been answered so much as it had been metabolized, and the person who woke up was slightly but genuinely different from the person who had fallen asleep. This is what Jung meant when he said that psychological development doesn't stop when the eyes close. It continues, in the dark, below awareness, on whatever material the threshold provided. And the people who provided it real material saw real change. Gradually, cumulatively, in increments so small that they couldn't point to any single night and say, that's when it happened. But over weeks and months, the accumulated effect was unmistakable. The first thing people tended to notice was their mornings. Something about the quality of waking shifted. The day didn't start with the same heaviness, the same reluctance, the same bracing for impact feeling that many people carry into their first conscious moments. There was a quality of having already begun, as if some part of the day's emotional groundwork had been laid in the hours before the alarm went off. Jung saw this as evidence that the unconscious had been working productively, integrating material that would otherwise have surfaced as morning anxiety or that low-grade dread that so many people accept as simply the texture of being alive. The dread didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened. It became more specific, more identifiable, more something you could face rather than something formless that sat on your chest. The dreams changed too, though Jung was careful about how much weight he placed on dream content versus dream quality. People who practiced threshold attention consistently reported that their dreams became less chaotic, less fragmented, more narratively coherent. The recurring nightmares, the ones that had cycled for years, the chase dreams, the falling dreams, the dreams of showing up somewhere unprepared, started to evolve. The chase slowed down. The fall landed somewhere. The unpreparedness turned into something else, something closer to curiosity than to dread. Jung read these shifts as evidence that the unconscious was processing material more efficiently because it was being given material voluntarily rather than having to ambush the ego with it during sleep. But the change that mattered most, the one Jung kept circling back to across decades of his own practice and his work with hundreds of patients, happened at the level of identity. Over time, and he was honest that the timeline was long, threshold practice produced a person with a fundamentally different relationship to themselves. Consider what happens, psychologically, when you spend years suppressing whatever surfaces at the boundary of consciousness each night. You're at war with your own depths. The unconscious sends something up and the conscious mind shoves it back down. Night after night, year after year, the same material gets rejected. The same feelings get swallowed. The same questions get drowned in distraction. This costs something enormous, and the cost isn't always visible. It shows up as rigidity, as an increasing narrowness of emotional range, as the slow hardening of a person into a fixed version of themselves that can't accommodate new information about who they actually are because new information keeps getting suppressed at the one moment each day when it has a chance to surface. Now consider what happens when that pattern reverses, when, night after night, the material is received instead of rejected, when the feeling is acknowledged instead of numbed, when the question is held instead of drowned. What happens, incrementally, is that the ego and the unconscious stop fighting. The relationship between the conscious self and everything underneath it begins to shift from antagonism to something more like cooperation. Jung called this the dialogue between ego and self, the self being his term for the deeper, more complete center of the psyche that encompasses everything the ego tries to exclude. When that dialogue develops, the person changes in ways that are difficult to describe from the outside, but immediately recognizable from the inside. There's a groundedness that wasn't there before, a capacity to sit with uncertainty without panicking. A growing sense that you have access to more than just your conscious mind when you need to make a decision or face something difficult, that there's a broader intelligence at work in you, and you've been learning to hear it. People around you might describe this as you seeming more settled, more present, harder to knock off balance. What they're seeing is someone who's been doing the quiet, invisible work of integrating themselves every night in the dark, and the accumulated result of that work is showing up in how they carry themselves through the day. Jung described this as a less defended ego. He meant that the conscious self, having spent months or years receiving material from the unconscious instead of fighting it, gradually loses its need to defend against its own depths. The walls thin. The filters become more permeable by choice rather than by breakdown. And paradoxically, this makes the person stronger, not more vulnerable. Because the energy that used to go into suppression, and that energy is staggering, far more than most people realize, becomes available for living, for creating, for engaging with the world from a place of fullness rather than from the constant low-grade exhaustion of keeping half of yourself locked in a basement. This is what Jung believed most deeply about the relationship between sleep and psychological development, and it's the piece that almost everyone misses. The hours of unconscious processing aren't empty time. They aren't the absence of development. They are, potentially, the most active site of development in the entire 24-hour cycle. What happens during the waking hours is mostly application, using what's already been formed, running the patterns that are already in place, performing the identity that's already been constructed. What happens during sleep, when the conscious mind finally steps aside, is formation itself, the building, the integrating, the slow, patient connecting of things the waking mind is too narrow and too busy to link. The people who changed most profoundly in Jung's experience were the ones who understood this, who recognized that their development didn't stop when they closed their eyes, and that what they carried to the threshold shaped what the unconscious had to work with. Give it anxiety and suppression, and it processes anxiety and suppression. The dreams churn, the body tenses, the morning arrives heavy. Give it avoidance and distraction, and you give it almost nothing. The opportunity passes unused, night after night, for years. But give it something real, an honest emotion, a genuine question, a piece of your own experience you finally stopped running from. And the unconscious has material it can actually use, material it can transform, material it can integrate into a version of you that's slightly more whole than the version that fell asleep. And here's what accumulates. You don't wake up one morning completely transformed. Jung would have been deeply suspicious of any claim like that. What happens is more like the way a landscape changes across seasons, so gradually that you can't point to the specific day anything shifted, but unmistakably different when you look back across the span of 6 months or a year. The anxiety that used to sit on your chest every morning thins out. The decisions that used to paralyze you start arriving with a strange clarity you can't trace to any specific moment of figuring it out. The sense of being at odds with yourself, that low-level civil war between who you are and who you're performing, begins to quiet, because the two sides have been in nightly conversation and they're starting to agree on something. If you've been feeling any of this, the pull towards something more honest, the sense that there's a version of your inner life you haven't been attending to, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this kind of quiet, ongoing work. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's framework, designed to give you something real to bring to the threshold. Something to carry into the stillness instead of reaching for distraction. The link is right below this video.